My name is Amanda Glassman, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here. You may have seen my earlier blog where I noted that many of our events branded as relating to women or women's issues have about a 13% male attendance rate. And this one, of our 275 respondents, about 9% were male. But I'm happy to see that the people who actually showed up are more of a mix. So welcome to everybody. And we're glad that you care about these important issues. So, here at the CGD, we were founded by Nancy Birdsall, a very prominent woman development economist, and maybe that shapes our interest and views in this area over time. I think, a couple of facts that have come out from my colleagues and others, I think, are worth just mentioning again as we start this discussion among a group of really great women. So first, Tanvi Jaluka and Charles Kenny, fellows and research associates here at the center, they found that about a third of the 5 highest paid think tankers in every think tank, they took a sample, are women. So definitely in the minority. About 2 of 10 think tanks and not-for-profits pay more or the same to women. I looked myself and my former employer and I said, how many women are on the board of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is an organization that was certified for gender parity by an external auditor? It's about 5 of 25. If I looked at the IMF, that figure would be much worse. And recent research at the World Bank finds that the price of discrimination, that wage gap, is about $27,000. So these are just facts. And I think many times when we've had these conversations amongst ourselves, people are afraid of being perceived as angry. And I think what I feel is it's probably okay. We're talking about fact-based anger. And that is a constructive anger because it's an anger where you can say, objectively, there's an issue here. Objectively, we can take matters. We can take action. We can change policy. So here at our own center, we ourselves are working on these issues. So I just want to acknowledge that we are in the same boat as everyone else. I already mentioned to you our participation rates in women-branded events. Now, I'm not sure how we could change that. Maybe our panel will have some really great ideas afterwards. But in our normal events, in our non-women-focused events, we're about 50-50. So what are we doing here? Maybe we should just remove the word women from the title and lure them with other ideas. Okay. But other ideas. So one very easy principle that we could all probably get behind is about recruiting, hiring, and paying similarly qualified people the same. That should be true no matter what kind of person you are. Second, to create a kind of peer ombudsperson for harassment or workplace issues. So, lots of times it's like, oh yeah, I talked to her, she's the management person or that's the HR person. It seems like that approach is not best practice. And Masood was telling me right before coming in here that they started to do that at the IMF. Third, we were thinking amongst ourselves about creating a kind of gender IATI, an international aid transparency initiative, but on gender parity. So we could think of a set of NGO or think tank principles and metrics. We could report them. Our funders could ask for them, could look at it over time. I think that would actually create a good kind of accountability. And finally, we have to address our own board and leadership issues. So without that, I'll leave those ideas with you. I'd love to hear back from you what your ideas are and suggestions. But I'll turn it over now to our esteemed panel. All of their bios were provided up in front. So I'll just welcome them to the stage. We have Kate Warren, who's the Executive Vice President and Resident Talent and Careers Guru. That is an awesome title at Devex. Kate. Cindy Huang, who's my colleague here, co-director of Migration, Displacement, and Humanitarian Policy, and a senior policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development. Angela Bruce Rayburn, who's the associate director for advocacy at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator, which is also a really interesting, here, I'll get off the stage since I'm in your way. She was formerly of Oxfam. Kate Wathen, also a CGD alumna, the DevX's engagement editor, and in a way, one of the people who really pushed to have us work on this cooperatively. And finally, Dr. Ellis Evans, a lecturer of international development at King's College London, and famously involved in the latest Twitter Fest? Sausage Fest, you name it. Okay, so I leave it to you to find all the solutions and take care of this little fact problem that we have discovered. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much, Amanda, and I'm sorry for anyone at home who was listening and my mic just flared out when I yelled that word, but I promise we will explain it a little bit later. There is a lot for us to unpack today, but we really have two goals. The first is to explore why an industry that gives billions of dollars to women's economic empowerment initiatives and funds gender equality has such a gender equality problem itself. And then the second most important one is to talk through concrete solutions about how we can move forward from these issues. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't start us off by talking about implicit bias. So with that, I want to start with you, Cindy, to talk a bit about what implicit bias looks like in international development and how that manifests in concrete things like the wage gap and leadership imbalances.
Great, thank you. I think probably many of the audience members are familiar with the implicit association or implicit bias tests that were spearheaded at Harvard, but it's really incredible to see how even with the best intentions and people who identify as not being sexist or racist, there are just very deep patterns and a deep history in our culture, in our country, and around the world that really does stack the deck. And so the way that it shows up, and I really love the theme of this panel, I'm really proud that CGD is hosting it, about practicing what we preach. And so just kind of looking at ourselves, Amanda cited some statistics, some others are that a quick review shows that 1/3 of the senior fellows at CGD are women, a quarter of the visiting fellows are women. Among senior fellows, less than about 20% are people of color. So the way it shows up is really who is elevated, who makes it to the top of a power structure. And that does also come up in wage differences, in opportunities for promotion, or the sense that when women exemplify the same behavior as men, they may be considered pushy or difficult, angry, when really there might be a reason for that, but really it's about our perceptions and cultural expectations.
So that is a nice segue into talking about the aforementioned Sausage Fest. Earlier this year, for those of you who are not aware, there was a blog that was published by Duncan Green at Oxfam that talked about the 10 big development thinkers. Essentially, all of them were white men from the global north. Alice Evans very delicately pointed this out on Twitter by calling it a #SausageFest, which some characterize the response as setting off a Category 5 Twitter storm. So, Alice, I want to hand it over to you to talk about what this says about implicit biases that exist within our industry.
Thank you. Firstly, amazing that so many people came today. This is really wonderful and I think reflects widespread support for change. So I think the blog is symptomatic of a broader problem in our society, that no one thinks they're biased, no one means to be biased, but we do it inadvertently without recognizing it. Because it wasn't just Stefan Derkon, it wasn't just Duncan Green. So many people retweeted that top thinkers in development, not even realizing that they were just reifying and reinforcing these inequalities. Very few people stop to think. And that's what we see every day in many of our organizations, whether it's the Oscars and we have a list of all male directors, as Natalie, or various awards, whether it's our politicians, and we just sort of reinforce these inequalities. We take them for granted, we go with the herd. But then something different happened this time. And I was not alone here. A lot of people thought, well, no, that's not okay. You've just reified these men and you've neglected women's brilliant contributions. So many people spoke out and they shamed Duncan Green, but they said, hell no, you got it wrong. And so this led to me sort of writing a counter blog and highlighting the importance of listening to more diverse perspectives. And what was really incredible then, so this is really nothing about me, nothing about the blog, but about the widespread support. So many people champion this and think, yes, we need to listen to more diverse views. People said publicly and openly, we need to change how we do things. And people saw that, and I think they were inspired, they were emboldened, and they realized widespread support for change. Because going back to implicit bias, I think there are 4 categories of people here. On the one hand, you have the self-assured, sexist douchebags. And these are people...
Tell us how you feel.
I can talk candidly here, right? Okay. So these are people who will reinforce inequalities. They will dismiss women's concerns. They will mansplain the answer to you. And they will be very confident. If you highlight that maybe you're concerned about something, they will be so confident they've got it right. They will dismiss you. They will marginalize you. I mean, there's this great... I was reading this book by Rennie Edo-Lodge, which says, we are more outraged by accusations of racism than racism itself. So often there's a tendency to be defensive. We want to think that we're nice people, we don't recognize our bias. So when people call us out on this, there's a tendency to put up barriers, to say, no, you've got it wrong. And what we need those people to do is to start listening. But no, they're these self-assured, sexist douchebags. But they may still virtue signal on Twitter. They may still retweet stuff about gender, whatever. Anyway, so that's category 1. Category 2, I think, are the silent critics. And that I put myself sometimes in that category. Those of us who are frustrated, fed up, wish we had more equality in our workplaces, would like for people to recognize women's contributions. But it's an uphill, tiring struggle. So often we keep our heads down, we go with the flow, because we don't think we'll be supported by others. Because we think that if we stick our neck out, it's exhausting, whether it's on race, gender, geography, LGBT, etc. It's exhausting to be continually fighting against these sexist douchebags. Okay, so we go with the flow, but then what we're doing is reinforcing these inequalities because we're allowing them to persist. That's category 2. Category 3 are the potential allies. These are the people who are open-minded, who are ready to listen, and who are taking on board and being thoughtful and thinking about what they can do differently. Then category 4, and I think many of the people in this room are in this category, those are the rebels. Those are the people who want to speak out. And the more of us who publicly speak out, who push for change, who hold those douchebags accountable, and who seek for those alliances with those potential allies, then the silent critics will see us. And they will be emboldened because they know they'll be supported by others. And through our movement, through speaking out together, we shame the sexist douchebags because they realize that publicly they cannot be mansplaining to women. Publicly they cannot be putting out a list of top 10 thinkers because it will be so embarrassing, because they will expect a backlash from us, the rebels. And that I want to see more rebels in this room.
Alice, I don't think anyone would accuse you of being the category 2. I mean, that is a good question. Is shame the answer? Is shaming the half of the population or the part of the half of the population who are not speaking out the answer? Angela, what is your take on that?
Well, I don't know if shame is the answer in a situation like, say, with us internally in some of our development organizations, because a lot of times these people are the bosses. So it's not like you are in a position to shame, especially for women who are single parenting, women who, their job matters. They can't just be in that position. But I think that I agree with Alice to the extent that we know these guys, right? They come to meetings unprepared, and we spend the night preparing. And we stay up all night. And I can tell you about many things I have to do when my husband is like, go to bed. What are you doing? And I say, well, tomorrow I have a presentation because I have to be good. I don't just have to be good, I have to be great. And then I go to the meeting and the guy don't even have notes. And he wears maybe pair of slippers. I've been in meetings like this and I'm all dressed up. And then I feel like, oh my goodness, look at the man, he's wearing beach shoes, right? And so it's this sense that those are the people that we work with, and so it's not always easy to shame them. Although it would be great to do it, I think, but I don't know that we in those of us in our organizations can do that.
I mean, you're touching on a lot of things, including, I think that, as a woman, if you go into a meeting, you're not prepared, you're wearing slippers, you bring your crumpled notes out of your pocket to figure out what you're going to say. I mean, you're treated differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the man he doesn't have the same, it doesn't have the same negative connotation when he literally stands up in front of the room and says, I have no notes. And you're thinking to yourself, really? Because you look at your little dissertation that you've written, and then you're like, so that's really the difference. Yeah. And who gets and you both get the same respect, I think, at some level.
Yeah. So, Kate, you have spent many, many years looking at the recruitment side of this. I mean, I want to talk a bit about the cost that can happen with speaking out, and then also kind of the gain. What have you seen in your work?
Yeah, well, just to echo that, you don't have to be good but great. That's also on the recruitment side. And research shows that comparable candidates, male and female, that apply to a job, a woman's going to have to show that she is much more qualified than the man would to be considered for the position. So all of these problems start back at recruitment and that implicit and sometimes very intentional bias that we see. So when we're looking at any of the solutions and policies, I think absolutely we have to start looking at how do we even bring people into our organizations, and then how do we grow them from there. So thinking about, and this is what I think about a lot in the work we do in advising other organizations who are looking at gender parity right now, is how do you actually make gains in this? And I think a lot of times when we're doing our hiring, we talk about cultural fit, which is really a proxy for somebody who looks like me or has the same experience as me. And considering that so many people in our hiring position are white men, it's not surprising that those are the people who tend to get hired. Something that we've even at Devex have kind of repositioned how we look at this, because you want people that fit within your organization, but it's who's going to add to our culture. It's not that you have to be a replica of us, but you are going to bring a different voice, a different perspective that's going to make us richer and better. And all the research shows that when you have diverse opinions, then you have, in the business world, higher profits, in the development world, higher impact. And I think it is pretty laughable. We're working with this group right now, Quantum Impact, on a series of bringing stories to light of women who had faced adversity in their career. And the women we're working with who started their own organization on helping advise organizations how to do this better did it because they were in a meeting. One of them was in a meeting, used to work for a development consulting firm, and they were working on a gender equality project, and it was about 12 men, white men, and her. And they were talking about how they could have a inclusive gender component to the program. And none of them saw the irony of the fact that it was 12 men trying to make that decision. So, I think that absolutely you can make the business case that it's imperative, and there's a lot that we can do starting from recruitment to see some headway.
Yeah, and something else that I think is really important to bring up in this conversation about implicit bias. Angela, today you published an op-ed where you wrote, as you have written and said before, that a core issue for international development and the humanitarian industry is race. And in the context of that op-ed, you were talking about the relationship between donors and aid recipients, but I'm wondering how that manifests within the development workplace.
So, so this morning I had written something that's published in Devex about this issue of how race intersects with gender and how oftentimes we talk about it in a separate way. And in fact, in the development world, it's actually sometimes not separated at all. So as a black woman, I'm going to work in Haiti. So I'm black, and all as are the recipients. But what happens in that environment is that there is this sense that I'm representing Oxfam, I'm representing an organization that is sort of distinct, and it's separated from the people that I'm there to help. And it has been, and in terms of the way that blackness, I want to use blackness because I want to represent for me, it's what I understand. At Oxfam, an organization where we go into these countries, we have a lot of money we want to bring, we want to help. But even in that context, there is not a sense of why it matters the kind of people or who you send to these countries to do work. Now, someone may say, well, that's not fair. If I'm good at my job, I should go. But what you miss is this sort of trust building. When you come into these countries, sometimes, as a white male, you come in and you have all the answers. And then these development people, these recipients are sort of like recipients. So they're relegated to this lower level or lower tier of the human chain, so to speak. So white guy comes in from the US, has the money, has all the development materials, he knows everything, he has all the answers, and he's basically there to tell you. And when you're in that recipient environment, it's very different for a person who's a recipient to even have an opinion about it. Because as far as they're concerned, those people are just there to help, right? So that's kind of like what you end up with. And for someone like me, working for Oxfam and being the only black person in the room to represent Oxfam, it was often times where I tried to, and being from the Caribbean, I wanted to bring that part of me to the conversation, because I wanted the people that I was working with to not just see me as being a representative of Oxfam, but to see me as someone that was empathetic, someone from the Caribbean, someone that understood the complexity of the situation that people were facing in Haiti. So I would oftentimes sort of be the translator, not but translating in terms of language, in terms of how to relate to people. So I would sit on one. So I was in this sort of dual role where I would talk to my Oxfam people, but then when I got to Haiti, I wanted to be different than that person that was in DC. Because in Haiti, I had to be, it was after the earthquake. I was coming into very difficult, painful, complex situations. So you had to bring something else that was not so much about our sort of American thing, if that makes any sense. And so for me, I think at the end, I felt that working for Oxfam and being a representative meant that I had to sort of live in this dual environment. And when I got to Haiti, I had to sort of shed that and become a person that was more woman, more Caribbean, more black, to be frank, because I felt like that was the only way that I could connect.
It sounds extremely stressful to have to adapt your identity depending on your setting.
Right.
Have you seen, you're talking about this in terms of Oxfam, but do you see this kind of across the humanitarian industry?
Yeah, because a lot of times when you go in these, that's the reality of the humanitarian industry. In terms of diversity, I think it's about, I recently read something about 17% of U.S. nonprofits have people that are people of color. In the UK, I think it's like 12%. So here's why I think it matters with racism. Because a lot of these countries, the people are black and brown. So that means when I go into these countries, they see me as what I am. And so across the spectrum, you go to these countries where the country directors of these countries are, people that are not connected. They may have the qualifications. So it goes back to what Kate's saying. How do we recruit better? How do we ensure that the pool really represents the people that you're going to serve? So oftentimes the pool is, you put it out on Indeed, you put it out on maybe Devex or something like that, and then the qualified people apply. But they may be qualified people that you need to find them, right, and bring them to the table. And oftentimes, I would go in these countries, Liberia, where I meet these country directors, and they're, these qualified, often white women, right? And they're smart, and they're talking, and they're directing, and they're telling you, and you see in some of these countries this sort of shrinking of the people who work in the organization because they are in a different there's a power differential between those people, the expats, and local people. And that differential is often, well, to be honest, it's racial, right? Because if you're in Haiti, then the people in the local office are going to be Haitians. So they're going to be different than, say, the person who comes from the US or England or wherever. So and it's not just Oxfam, but it's everywhere you go. And so recruiting matters, and bringing in those people really matters.
That's a really good segue, because this clearly doesn't just take policy to fix. This doesn't just take an organizational, shift in culture to fix. But I want to start by talking about the concrete policies that organizations can enact in order to have a more diverse, a more gender equal workplace, somewhere that is just better for everyone to work. Kate, I want to hand it over to you with all of your recruiting experience, because you have often said that this really starts at recruitment.
Yeah, well, and research shows that women feel like they have to be 100% qualified to apply for a job, whereas men like 60%. So there's a lot of very qualified women out there who aren't even putting their name in the hat to be considered for a position. So it does take, and a lot of organizations we work with are like, oh, well, we put the job out there, we put it on Devex, and these are who applied, so what can we do? And no, you do have to go out there and find them, and you also have to think about how you structure your job qualifications and the requirements to be put in there. A lot of them do have implicit bias built in, and a lot of the requirements that might be written might not actually be necessary for the job and could be excluding a lot of really great people. You see a lot of that within the USAID contractor world, and you're getting requirements passed down from USAID, and it can have a real disconnect from people are hiring who will fit those qualifications to help win a contract, not who's actually best suited to do that job. So it starts even from those basics of thinking about who do I really need to be successful in this role, and am I structuring the qualifications in a way that's going to leave out some really good people. Some groups talk about having quotas, and I'm not a big fan of quotas because I feel like it just forces you to fill people that aren't necessarily right, and it can actually have adverse negative ramifications. But thinking about quotas more in your pipeline, and that you should be looking for at least 50% female applicants in your applicant pool, and then making decisions from there. And some of that does take more investment, and that's time and money in finding those women and convincing them to apply. And when you think about some of that implicit bias, particularly in the development context, a lot of positions are in hardship countries or overseas. There's a lot of dual career couple challenges. But a lot of people see, if you're working in Haiti, for example, that post-conflict, maybe it's a tough place to work and that women are just weaker. Or that women with families aren't going to be able to travel. And some women perfectly are capable of traveling, but there's often that kind of implicit bias when somebody's applying that, oh, she's not really going to be committed and be able to do this job. Some research shows that when you look at equally qualified applicants, mothers are 79% less likely to be considered for a position. So all that starts from the very beginning of the recruitment. When you look at making your hiring decisions, I work with a lot of UN agencies, and they have all these great policies that sound great, but the reality is that people apply, and the person who makes the hiring decision is the mostly white male hiring manager. And you really need to bring other people to the table. And I've seen some groups, and when we look at the private sector, I think Google and others, for example, they don't let those hiring decisions be made in silos. They bring in other people, make sure there's a diverse hiring panel. They also do this for promotions and salary negotiations, which has the same impact. So you want to make sure you're bringing more voices and more perspectives in making those decisions.
So something that you just touched on was the people who are making the hiring decisions kind of portends to people being in leadership, where there is a gap that we've already talked about. Cindy, I'm curious your take on what kind of policies can foster more gender equality at the top, whether that's the top of your organization or within a department.
Well, I think a lot of the ideas that Kate raised were really important. I think also just looking at, for example, in the field of development economics, only 1 out of 5 of people in tenure track positions are women. So you really see how if you want to work on that pipeline, you have to start really early. So I think that's one important step. How can we all contribute as a community, not just as individual organizations, but how can we come together to really build that pipeline? I also think, I agree that quotas can have negative effects, but I think there are a lot of lessons from other industries like the private sector that have been doing a lot. So for example, there are some activist, proactive investors who have started to say, because we believe that decision-making is improved when you have diverse voices, when you have diverse perspectives. It could be even as narrow of a perspective as we know women are, they do a lot of the decision-making around consumption, so we know that diverse pools of people make better decisions. So they're saying that if we're going to invest in your company, we want to see proof that you're making progress at the board level and at management level in terms of your hiring. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities out there. We shouldn't only rely on top-down change, but place big funders could look at that as a criteria when the examples that have been raised around how that actually matters for your bottom line in development, that would be your social impact. So I think that that's an opportunity there. And then Amanda raised in the opening about this idea of a peer review mechanism, and I think that could be really important in terms of generating a race to the top. So having some set of principles and guidance, sounds like some of these ladies could help design those, of kind of like what are the best practices, and then having us come together as a community and then to peer review each other to really encourage progress. And I think by seeing that kind of leadership from some leading institutions, that can really change the dynamic around what people see as, the natural example of what a leader can be. It should be a more diverse vision, and it will take, I think, a number of these steps to get there.
And beyond closing the leadership gap, we've covered a lot. I love the idea of an EADI for gender equality. What about other things like closing the gender gap, or other policies that would really help women retain women, especially after they become moms? That statistic you gave, Kate, was dismal. What other policies are important? Alice, over to you.
Okay, so besides talking about policies, I think we should think about individuals, interactions, organizations, and sectors. So like at the individual level, because no one wants to be biased, no one thinks they are biased, what I personally find it really helpful to do, both on race, gender, geography, is to check myself, to keep tabs on my own behavior. So whether it's in terms of the research I'm citing, my references, my reading list, just to be aware of the proportions of people I'm promoting and amplifying. So I have a little podcast, for example, and I'm consciously thinking about how many white men am I promoting in that podcast. Not because I intend to be an arsehole, I really don't, but sometimes I'm unaware of how much of an arsehole I am. So it's helpful for me to keep tabs on it. So that's one, checking myself. Two, at the interactional level. So there's a tendency for loud people to talk in meetings and dominate over the quieter voices. But what we can do as women is amplify each other's contributions and say, what I thought was really great was from Cindy, and Cindy highlighted this, and then we can solicit contributions from quieter people so we can amplify their voices in our interactions. Then in our organizations, social change accelerates when we see others changing. So key is to publicize our deviance, publicize all the changes that we're making inside our organizations to push others to be better. So for example, if organizations publish that they will not accept manels, for example, or that they will have new policies to address sexual harassment, or that they will be joining what I think was, now I'm doing it right now, Cindy's excellent point about a peer review mechanisms. So I think it would be really wonderful if we had 5 things that organizations are doing. So you could check their gender pay gaps, you could check the proportion of women on their boards, etc. 5 things, all organizations sign up to this, and you'd see how organizations were doing. And that would shame, going back to our earlier discussion of shame, you'd want to be at the top of the list rather than at the bottom. And I think that would accelerate the process of social change by seeing how we're doing on that ranking. And that, I think, could galvanize some of those sexist douchebags to start bucking up their ideas a little bit.
So a common theme that I'm hearing here is transparency, and putting the pressure on other organizations, on other people to sort of adopt policies. But I want to get really granular here, and we are going to draw back out into organizational culture. But if you had to make a recommendation tomorrow to the head of an organization about what are the 3 policies that you can enact over the next few weeks, the next year, that will move the needle, in addition to initiatives that have to do with organizational culture, what would they be? Angela?
I think that one of the things that I think would be an interesting idea is to have a sort of a ombudsman or public trust kind of sort of independent entity. They could be a part of the organization, but it could be sort of independent of the organization. And that group of that, or that woman, would be a part of being sort of like the conscience of the organization. I think a lot of times in organizations, we get bogged down in the work that we do. We do a lot of work, we write a lot of things, we publish a lot of papers, we go on and on and on. But I think that the internal reflection, self-reflection, we don't do well. Most organizations don't, because you are part of this big picture of things that you need to do. But it'd be so interesting if we could be where there would be some kind of an ombudsman, and this group would operate as sort of like getting better information, better reporting. When things are going wrong, who do you turn to? A lot of times it's not HR, because a lot of times when you're in the farm, when you're in the field, if you're in Haiti, HR is far, far away. You don't know who that HR person is. You don't trust them. So you don't know who to tell. It would be so interesting if we had a way of like sort of getting that part of the energy of the organization to tell us about what's going on when we are not there. How are people really feeling? And then it gets to this emotional idea. Oh, we're always touchy-feely because women want to know. But it really matters, because I feel every time I went to Haiti, I felt that the fact that I was connected to the staff, that I got way more information about all the stuff that was going on, good and bad, that people in the office people in DC never knew, didn't know about. And I think we need that. We need this kind of, I call it an ombudsman, because I don't know how else to articulate that, but I feel like it would be an information place where where you can reflect on what the organization's true mission and purpose is, and are we accomplishing it, and making that a robust part of the organization. And yeah, that's where I would start. Yeah.
Cindy, you've worked quite a bit with different government agencies. You were at State Department, you were at MCC. How do you see the idea of an ombudsman working in that context?
I think it's, well, right now there's already a requirement around having an ombudsperson in the office for a variety of EEO complaints or other kinds. So I think, I think though that it could be really expanded. So I think right now it's some pretty limited training, and then you're free to do your job, but I think there are a lot of complex issues that come up. So I think what would be really interesting is to have an ombudsman like that really undergoes a lot of the implicit bias training that we've talked about, is aware of the various levers that are out there, to also participate, not only to be a person who's facing inward and trying to answer concerns and channel them to the appropriate offices, but if you could think about really connecting up people to make it more of a movement. I think that applies not only in government, but it's really when you get these people together and you can identify, again, those higher level policy changes, which I think could be really powerful. And I just wanted to weigh in quickly on the issue of kind of the structural issues, particularly for mothers. And so there have recently been a good set of studies in the Nordic countries which collect a lot of detailed information. And what they find is that the gender pay gap is very small, or even zero, except for women who have children. And I would really push us to be, if I could list my top 3 policies, but well, one of them would be, can we be more creative about what's possible in international development? And I wanted to give a shout out to Pam Jackiello, who she was, and there she is, she was attending a conference of economists in London, and it was just like, well, they were like, well, you can't bring your kids, and like, no, they can't have the food here, they can't, and it was just like, really? Does that have to be the situation? Could you offer food for children? Could you help not? I know there are cost implications sometimes, so like maybe you don't have to pay for my childcare, but could you at least facilitate, because I'm coming to a different country where I may not know about those opportunities? And that's just one small example where asking that question led to change. And I would ask those questions about the broader development sector. I know some companies that do allow people to bring, if you're higher up in the organization, you can bring your children on trips. And again, I know that there have to be the practical considerations around cost, but I would really challenge how much of it is about cost, and how could we change some of the parameters of the field, of the discipline, to say, no, we can make it easier for you to sometimes travel with your children, for your husband too as well, not just for the women. And are there more creative ways, and are there support structures that can help reduce some of those inequalities, which in turn would reduce some of those biases and assumptions about what women can and cannot do? Let's not only get rid of that assumption, let's also push the boundaries on how we can change the field so that it can create equal opportunities for leadership for men and women.
Here, here.
You want to weigh in on that?
No, absolutely. I 100% agree. And I do know some other a friend of mine who works on breastfeeding programs, and with her infant was asked to speak at a conference on breastfeeding halfway around the world, and luckily her organization did let her bring her young child, and it really wasn't. They basically had to make a few phone calls to try to find a babysitter, make sure that there was a room available for nursing in the hotel, and it was not a big issue, and allowed her to be able to go and not be able to taking a step back in her career. So I do think that sometimes women are afraid to ask for those because they don't want to stick their necks out and be seen as causing problems. So the more women that are in leadership roles and can think about this and push for it in their organization, hopefully it will reduce the stigma. More men that do as well, that definitely helps.
But I also think that there's also the fact that of women looking back for other women, right? And let's be honest, that's not always the case, right? Some of us, women, I keep hearing us saying all the time, if there's more women in Congress is going to be better. I don't know if that's true. Congress may never be able to be good, but I think that the question is it a burden? How fair is it to say once you get to the place where you're trying to go, what does it mean that you must look back and say to the women coming behind you, here's how to do it, and to be mentoring them? Because men generally, they just go play football together or whatever they do, right? Golf or whatever, right? It's not the same way for us. So I think that with us, we have to be intentional, right? I have to say, I'm a black woman, I'm educated, so that means if I get to this next job, I got to look in the rearview mirror and I got to think about the women that's coming behind me, younger women, black women, but other women as well. And it has to be intentional. And I think that we are sometimes so focused on getting to that C-suite or wherever we were trying to go, we're so focused on getting there that when we get there, it's sort of exhausting at that point because now you got to work to stay there. And that means maybe you don't have the energy or the impetus or whatever it takes to look back. And I think that we have to really admit that that's a reality and then say to ourselves, we have to be intentional. And I just want to say, because I just want to give a brief example of being at Oxfam and knowing a young woman who I was just lucky enough to be in a room where the decision makers were talking, and there was an opportunity for a project in Haiti. And I remember that we talked about hiring, and no one remembered this person other than me. And the only reason I know her is because she's a Haitian woman, we're friends, and I got to knowing about her life outside. And I said, well, what about this woman? It turned out that she went to Haiti, got the project, went to Haiti, worked for Oxfam for 2 years, came back, went from being an administrative person to getting a policy advisor's job. And why was she able to get that job? Because she had the opportunity to go to Haiti. And she would not have had that opportunity if I was not in the room saying, what about her? And she was able to go from a policy advisor to go to Cornell Business School. So just that small opportunity in a room where people making a decision where you can suggest someone and that person gets an opportunity. And oftentimes we're not in the room. And when we're not in the room, we don't get the opportunities. And as a black woman, I can say to you, I feel that all the times when I'm not in the right place and I don't have other women in the right place who can say, what about Angela? What about this person? And I feel that we have to be intentional.
So we're talking a lot about leadership kind of as an anchor to really build more equal workplaces, more diverse workplaces. Bridging over to the culture question, policies don't work if people don't care about them. So how can leaders really foster a more inclusive work environment? I open the floor.
Just to, example I think maybe I touched on earlier is that a lot of organizations, the leadership is made up of men, and so they have the excuse of, well, I don't necessarily have those other perspectives, and when they're making decisions, they can still seek out, there probably are very capable women or women of color or people from other diverse backgrounds that they could bring in to be making decisions that doesn't necessarily have to always be at the leadership level. We were talking a little bit earlier about some of the equity between maternity and paternity leave that organizations are doing, and that's parental leave for both men and women, which I think is absolutely critical, but that you find that many men don't take them. And I was giving an example, I won't name names of my husband's company, where their leadership is all male, and when they passed this parental leave policy, and a couple of his business partners, their wives became pregnant, they didn't take the leave. And it was like, well, you know, that's a signal to everyone in the organization.
Right, absolutely.
And if you're not taking it, they can't take it. And when men don't take that leave, it creates even a bigger divide. So it really does you have to walk the talk, and really has to come from the top, and men in those positions, in addition to women who are looking to amplify others.
Yeah. And I was just going to add that also then on the positive side, that studies have shown that when men do take the paternity leave, that the people in their reporting chain are more likely to take it. So I think I think that's making the same point of really walking the walk is so critical, and I think it can be done across, all of the things that we've talked about. Like, I really appreciate Alice's point about, let's not be defensive. So I think to the extent leaders can really listen and sit with there's a lot of discomfort there around implicit bias. And so can leaders really demonstrate how they can sit with it and come up with policies and be consistent in the follow-up? I think that is the best thing that can happen.
May I make 3 points?
Yes, of course.
Briefly.
Please.
Okay, so one thing, for any kind of inequality, the people at the top speak with greater authority and greater legitimacy to their peers. So men will listen more to other men, white people listen more to other white people because of racism and sexism. So when these privileged groups speak out, they have so much greater legitimacy. So their voices are incredibly important in legitimizing these struggles. They are potential allies. That said, we do not need to wait for them. So yes, leadership is important, and if they're willing to do that, I applaud them. But I am not going to sit back and wait for these people to take our side, because actually, there's huge support for doing things differently, and we collectively can push for change and demand for change. And they will realize that they've got to go with the flow because the tide is changing. So that is my second point, that we don't need those leaders. My third point is that there is another set of leaders that are incredibly important, and that's donors. So donors could be demanding more from the organizations they fund. Donors could be supporting external reviews. So for example, I am incredibly impressed by Penny Mordaunt, the British Minister for International Development, and she's supporting external review and auditing with regards to sexual harassment. Because a common problem in any sector is that organizations tend to quash abuse. They want to keep it quiet because they want to preserve their reputations. They don't want to be seen to be doing bad, whether it's the church, whether it's a political party, whether it's a business, etc. They keep it under the carpet, and as such, victims don't think they'll be believed, and perpetrators know that they'll get away with it. So what that means is it perpetuates the abuse, because victims won't report it. Change happens when the sanctions are publicized, when people realize that people will be punished, when people realize they'll be supported. But the problem is that organizations don't want to do that because they want to preserve their reputation. So external review, donors can be an incredibly powerful role. So leadership at the donor level is important.
That actually speaks perfectly to a question that we got on Twitter about Sarah Driver said, would love to know if there are efforts by funders to encourage or require organizations to practice what they preach before they win bids.
Mm-hmm. I think some foundations are doing that, and then certainly in like Silicon Valley, a lot of investors are doing that. It would be interesting to see, USAID and their push for localization has even just scoring grants and contract proposals. Having a chief of party who's local from the country will get more points. I've never seen anything like that when it comes to having gender equality within the organization or the team you're proposing. Something like that could be interesting, because that would get an organization's attention if it's the difference between them getting funding or not. I don't know if anyone's seen this actually in action.
If anyone in the audience has seen this in action, please speak up during the Q&A. We would love to hear about it. All right, there's one more question that I have, and I want to hear from each person before we switch over to questions from Twitter, and it looks like we have quite a few, which is excellent. Keep them coming, please, Twitter. It is about allyship, and I want to hear from each of you just, in short, what would be your advice for your male colleagues and your female colleagues to be a good ally in this effort to have a more inclusive industry? And we'll start with Cindy.
Okay, I have a little bit of an unconventional one. I think there's the general, speak up, and I'm sure others will mention this, but one is around empathy. So my research is on refugees and displacement, and there was recently a really interesting study that asked people, it was a YouGov poll, and they asked people, they said, well, imagine what it's like to be a refugee. If you were fleeing, what would you take with you? And then asked people to take action by writing a letter. And people who were, treated with this, being asked to imagine what it's like to be a refugee were far more likely to write the letter. And I think, that's a pretty extreme situation, but I think for people, allies and would-be allies, to really take that as a kind of personal check and say, before responding, before, making an HR decision, really think about from someone else's perspective, what could this world look like? And I think that just first step in empathy, if you can make it a habit, can be so important, again, to being a good listener, seeing other perspectives, and checking yourself.
Yeah, I think particularly when it comes to men, checking yourself, we talk a little bit about amplification, and we, before this panel, we were talking about how that White House article came out about a lot of the women in the White House did that, but it was women amplifying each other. Men can also amplify other women. Thinking about, I recently had a male colleague who, because this has been a topic of conversation, I think, in a lot of organizations, which is really exciting to see that a lot of people are discussing this internally as it's become more mainstream. And he actually asked me, what is it that I could be doing better? And really, don't worry, you can lay it on me, and I'm totally open ears. And him saying that, I was like, well, actually, I do have some advice that I was able to share with him, and he took it without being defensive. And I think he actually really took it to heart and said, wow, yeah, those are really good points. I never thought about it. That gets to the empathy. So if you aren't sure, you can ask a woman.
Alice?
Join the rebels.
Understood. Copy that. Angela?
So I think I agree with you, Cindy. And interestingly enough, it's like I was talking to someone recently about Black Lives Matter. And one of the things that we were talking about, it might have been my husband, I can't remember. But we were talking about how if white people were as involved in Black Lives Matter, it would have such a different impact. Because as it stands, it's just a bunch of, complaining black people, right? Complaining about the unarmed killing of black men in the street. And so this idea of empathy, what does it feel like to be in my world? In my world of having a lot of education, being able to speak a foreign language fluently, how is it when I sit across from you in an interview, but I'm not really being my best self? I'm really going through in my head all the things that I think you might be nitpicking. Oh my God, look at her hair. It's terrible. Black women, hair is a thing. Am I too big? Am I too small? So you go through in the interview, when you're sitting across from this hiring person, you're not really your best self, because you're also, even though you have the qualifications during the interview, you are also going through all the possibilities of what this interview could really mean. And I think if we did this, you call it empathy, but I call it more like this kind of emotional intelligence, right? This kind of way of understanding that the world is changing and people like me are here to stay. And I'm here to take what I deserve to take. In other words, what my education will bring me. So how does that translate itself into work? And I just want to say that it's about emotional intelligence, it's about empathy, but it's about understanding that you have to get in the game. And so for me, I tell my white friends, you got to be in Black Lives Matter. You got to go to those rallies, because guess what? Because if you do not go to those rallies, here's what you're saying. You're saying, I think Black Lives Matter, right? You and me are friends individually, but in the broader scope of it, not so much. And I think that's what we need in work.
All right. From Twitter, we have one that says, what is the role for major funders of this work? Where should we use carrots versus sticks? We got into that a bit. Anything else? No? Okay. All right. And then the last question from Twitter is for you, Angela. This says, for women of color on the panel, has your identity ever made you uncomfortable with the rhetoric that development agencies use when referring to developing world women? How do you navigate that while balancing professional responsibility / fear?
All the time. Because in our rhetoric, we talk about equality all the time, right? We speak of equality, but when I go into these countries, I'm like, okay, I know that I'm coming as a representative. So I have to also, it's my job to come there and to spout the rhetoric to you. And it's incredibly difficult. In a place like Haiti that I love, how can I spout the rhetoric at the same time tell the truth? And it was always difficult in Haiti. And I feel like I did it by being me. So like I said, when I would get to Haiti, I'm the black woman coming from the US. So I feel you. I understand you. I understand the country. I understand where you're coming from. I understand that your life is not like mine. And when I come to you, I'm coming in a very, in my true self. And even if what we're talking about, I have to come and tell you some things that you don't want to hear, but this is how I got to do it. So that was my pride and joy when I worked in Haiti. I felt like I brought empathy and I brought serious consideration for the people that I had to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you. Would like to open it up to the audience over here.
So my name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist by training. I'm probably one of the elder women here, so I'd like to share a little bit of my experiences of 30 years in the international organizations. I'm listening, and I think there needs to be a distinction among two very important issues. One of them is a culture of global development. What does global development in and of itself mean? And having been the only woman in many, many, many meetings and raising my hand and being a rebel and being actually at FAO, I was kicked out of a meeting. I think there needs to be an extraordinarily deep reconceptualization of what does development actually mean. Because the model itself, and I'm hearing you use the word industry, it's not an industry. I didn't go into an industry. It has evolved into the term of an industry. It began with people wanting to share expertise. It began with people wanting to travel the planet and be able to introduce practices that may have been allow people to work better with the land, have more equitable livelihoods. I mean, there really has been an evolution in the language. And part of what I've tried to do is fight for that, so that we don't always talk about development as if this is, I mean, you can even see the developed nations versus the underdeveloped. Is it first world? Is it second world? I mean, what label of the month are we going to use about inequity? That's one thing. And I think it's very important because as a woman, having spent much of my professional career trying to offer an alternative vision of what it is that we actually do. And when you sit at a table with men who have been trained to talk about, we have the truth, we are the knowledgeable people. If you come in as a woman, and especially if you come, many women such as myself, we come in from the social sciences, and we don't come in as economists or agronomists. We come in from a very different professional background, which means we're offering a very different perspective. And that's the issue, is getting on the agenda with a completely different conceptualization of what development is. So I think what you've been talking about is very important, and I really am pleased that there are a lot of young women here, but I really think we have to look at, it's not just gender issues. It's a much bigger discussion about power and authority and scientific truth, if you will, or economic truth, if you will, and who carries that message forward. I mean, I've sat with women where I've gone, oh my God, what are you doing here? You're as oppressive as the people you're saying not to oppress. So I would really look at even the bigger label of industry. What is development? And I would actually offer that it's time for a brand new paradigm. Let's make a real shift. Let's redefine power and authority.
Thank you for that critique. Over here.
Hi, I'm Wade Channel from USAID. I thank you, first and foremost. I could just go in so many directions, but thank you for your voices here. One comment here, I would note that this industry idea, yeah, I agree. It is more than just a gender issue, but I would say if you read the Harry Truman Point 4 speech, which we refer to for development, it is fundamentally flawed from the outset. The system has been fundamentally flawed intellectually from the outset, with superiors helping the non-superiors. And until some of us get through that paternalism, it's going to not be very good. Now, you may have sort of answered this question already, but I suffer from male pattern listening disorder. So I
know
just
that
want
one that you speak of.
Yeah, it's powerful sometimes. How do we hold each other accountable? I'm from USAID. You're from groups that we fund in many cases. What would you like us to do to hold you accountable to equality? And what would you like to be able to do to hold us accountable as well? Because we're having these discussions, and I have been told, I'm working on something where I was told, are you telling me that you're telling the contractors they can hold us accountable? And I sort of paused and I said, yes, that's what I'm saying. He said, good, make it stronger. So there is some desire here, but as part of that listening process, having your ideas about how you could hold us accountable is probably much better than our ideas about how you could hold us accountable. Thanks.
We'll take one more and then we'll go through.
Good afternoon. My name is Francesca Molinaro. I'm the current Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Director at Chemonics and the former Diversity Advisor for the Inter-American Development Bank. And when we opened, we talked about, or Amanda mentioned the process we went through. And I think that I led that process, and reflecting on it, that was very valuable because that wasn't stating we have reached gender parity. It was an external methodology, very rigorous data collection, and external audit of our gender practices. And we know from development what gets measured gets done. And I think it's very valuable. Also, when the World Bank did it, the IDB did it, the ADB did it, then the IMF did it, there's a peer pressure because, well, if that organization is turning the light on themselves and is being introspective, then what does it say about us if we're not doing it? And I think there were some very tangible, important outcomes. We did a lot to move the needle. We had a target, which I think is another really important strategy, not a quota, but a target, something that we have a goal that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to. We didn't make it. That was to get 40% of women in senior roles. We got to 38%, and we moved about 10% because we were very deliberate focusing on that target. And when we did our reorganization for our private sector, an entire new C-suite, 6 positions, 50-50 gender balance. 3 women were hired, 3 men were hired. I'm not saying it's a perfect organization, and there's still things we need to do. I'm commenting because I think having rigorous methodology around how we look at these issues is extraordinarily powerful. I also know that that assessment process was very expensive and that most players in this space can't afford that. They're not the World Banks. So that's my comment, and my question is, besides an index or in addition to an index, what can we do to hold each other accountable and actually measure these things in an objective way?
Thank you. So we'll start with those 3. We had just comments about the power dynamic within the industry that we all work in. We're talking about what we would like to see from funders, what we would like to have them see from us in terms of accountability, and then real tangible benchmarks for accountability. So I will hand it over to Alice.
Sure. Okay, so I think this idea of mutual accountability is really brilliant. And it's about getting our own houses in order. Let's stop being paternalistic. Let's look at ourselves. And so I think USA, DFID, and other organizations could take the lead here in supporting external review. So my research on inequality and social change emphasizes that social change accelerates when we see others changing. So we need to publicize the changes that we're making, and we need to compare ourselves to others because no one wants to be at the bottom of that league table. So I think the absolute best thing to do, let's create some cheap ways of calculating inequalities in any organizations. For example, the gender pay gap on aggregates, the proportion of women on the board, just 3 cheap things that any organization could do. Every organization submits it to this external review housed by USA, DFID, etc. And then we rank them and compare. Then we see how each others are doing, and that motivates reform. Boom.
Thank you, Angela.
Solve that.
So I was just thinking about what the lady in the back was talking about with the paternal. At the end of the day, what you're saying is that we created a flawed system anyway. We are talking about rich countries, rich white countries going into places with brown people and black people and telling them what to do. That's what you're saying, essentially. And yes, you're right, because, and then people like me, we go to work there and we have to, acknowledging that and knowing that creates this other issue when you get into these countries, because now you're kind of spouting the things that you kind of know is complete crap, for lack of a better word. So I guess it's how do we change that dynamic? That's an interesting question. And the gentleman from USAID mentioned about the paternalism. We live in development is paternalistic, right? So I feel like part of what we need to be looking at is how does that change? To me, it changes if we look at our models of aid and I hate this word empower, but I'm going to use it because just to say that it changes when we understand that all that is smart and right does not only come from this part of the world. There are very smart people in Haiti, well-educated people in Haiti who know exactly what to do to make their country better. They know, but they are continuously battered by us, battered by our thoughts and our thinking and our methodologies and our language of development. Words that we're always using, and they're like, and we're always changing it, and half the time they're confused. Maybe part of what has to happen is we need to start listening to these people. They know what's best for them. After the earthquake, I met women after women I met in Haiti who said to me, you guys come here, you create this big structure, but you know what? We don't need all that. We don't need the school there. We need the school here where we can get to it. But instead, USAID is going to give money to build a school far, far away where we need 10 buses to get there. So we don't want to go to that school. So it's this idea that we go with our things. And it's time for us to know that there are people in these countries that know exactly what they want, and they may be poor. But partly, don't forget, if we want to get into another tangent, which we don't, but just that they're poor because, part of development has made them poor, right? Let's also say that. So I just want to say that we need to start listening to other people. Just like we talk about listening to women, people in these countries know exactly what they need, and we need to listen to what they have to say. That's how I feel that we can address some of the paternalism that you're speaking about.
Well, just to add to that, when you look at diversity in recruitment and hiring, looking at socioeconomic diversity too is incredibly important. And anyone who just works in this sector knows that you have to do an unpaid volunteership, an unpaid internship. The barrier to entry is really high, and it really excludes a lot of people and a lot of different voices from actually even having a chance to work in this sector and on these issues. So that's one thing that is probably a whole nother panel discussion. Yeah. But Wade, on your question around what USA can do, I recently wrote an opinion piece on that lovely biodata form that you have all the contractors fill out, which asks for your previous salary history, in which so many implementers base the salaries off of, and in several states in the US that's now become illegal to ask for previous salary history because they saw it had an adverse impact on women and really it contributed to the wage gap. Yet you see this as used as a tool, not only on USAID grants and contracts for determining salary, but a lot of implementers now just use that for across the board for a lot of their hiring because it's easy. And when I wrote this, I had so many women reach out to me and be like, yes, oh my gosh, this damn form has been bane of my existence. So that's something I would push you all to look at and re-examine how salaries are set. And then I am really excited to hear about your new position at Chemonics. We recently surveyed employers and asked if they did have a diversity or inclusion or somebody who's focused on the organization, and it was about 20% of the organization that responded that had a position that actually focused on this. I think there may be additional 15% that are considering it. So that shows you that it's really not important in a lot of organizations. Resourcing it is really a challenge for smaller organizations. So as we think about USAID awarding contracts and thinking about how there really is no appreciation for some of the overhead that some of these HR procedures and policies take to actually have a fair and equitable way of running your organization in many different ways, and staff support and wellness. And I would just encourage USA to think a little bit about how they incentivize that through even structuring their contracts and how they pay them.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to focus on, which is stop thinking about these investments, which are investments not only in our institutions, but also in development impact, per the conversation we've been having, as just general overhead, which there's often a lot of pressure to reduce. And I think it was so nice for me I feel like in some ways both of you answered each other's questions in terms of, how can we have this accountability? I totally endorse Alice's idea. Let's come up with just a few maybe less resource intensive indicators that we should all report to, and I think then USAID can play a really big, and other donors, the Gates Foundation and DFID, can come together and maybe, as an example, create a portal where all of that information is transparently reported. And then also I think the accountability back to these donors is to say, we're gonna have a real conversation that's not about the procurement process, but is really about what are the measures and what do we as a community have to do to take that next step and hold each other accountable.
You got all that, Wade? Just
Easy peasy.
Great. We'll take some more questions. Malika? We have a...
I'm Malika, a reporter with NPR. My question is, what is it that, why does it matter that what you guys are talking about up here, how does that actually help the people who NGOs and the aid community are actually helping? I really want to make the connection really strong and clear. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Yeah. We'll take over here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Elise Young with FHI 360. And I just want to piggyback off of that good question. It's similar about how are we within our organizations, as we're looking at gender equality, applying that and making the connection to our projects. Just to say one thing on that, there's the interaction gender audit that looks at both internal processes as well as our projects. There's also the minimum standards for mainstreaming gender equality, which is coming up on its 1-year anniversary, which has standards for both internal and external. But I think a question to all of you is, how do we also engage donors to ask, and maybe for Wade, that those RFPs or RFAs are saying, that your staffing and how you're treating gender equality internally has to be in place in order to connect to how you're treating gender equality externally. What do we do internally, and how do we engage donors on that conversation?
Thank you. And we'll take one more in the back.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a wonderful discussion. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm with a group called Transparency International. One question, in terms of being a rebel. The executive directors of the multilateral development banks are overwhelmingly male, to a huge percentage, whether it's the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. And these, of course, are the representatives of the countries. So it's not just a US problem per se. How do we change that? Because having worked at the World Bank for a number of years and having consulted to all of the others at the board level, if we don't change the boards, I'm skeptical about the degree of change you get lower down. So how do you get to be a rebel to change the boards of the multilateral development banks? Thanks.
Question. So start with those three. I will say we unfortunately have about 5 minutes, but we had the question about making sure that this conversation and the content of it really translates for the people that those who work in international development are serving. The second was about donor engagement, and the third about how to join the rebellion.
Can I speak really quickly to those 2 points, or Malika's point and that last point? So we cannot, development is incredibly complex. We don't have the answers, and we know that because otherwise we would have solved that. We cannot resolve complex problems if we only listen to a tiny minority. So we need to expand that. That's an easy case. And I refer you to the viral blog by Alice Evans for that. Okay, so that's one. second thing about how do we change these multilaterals, big boards. We start by our own practices. I believe that we can create the world that we want to be in. And if we in this room push for change in our own organizations, then we publicize the change in our own organizations, then we shift the norms, then these multilaterals will see that times are changing and they've got to keep up with us because otherwise it will get embarrassing. So we strengthen the Rebel Alliance, we publicize what we're doing, and they get pushed to come along with us. Shame.
With respect to what Malika is her name, you were asking about how it connects. Well, in some of these countries, where the country directors are male, most of the staff, and then the people that they're serving are overwhelmingly female. So you will find that you will go in a place in certain parts of Haiti where it's in the rural areas, and it's guys with their guy things. Talking to women about things they have no understanding of. They don't understand what it's like to live in a refugee camp, and at night you have to go in a group to the bathroom because you could be raped or assaulted on your way to the bathroom. So I think that it connects because we have to admit that internally our gender issues impact what happens when we go into these other countries and we're trying to tell them what to do when our own house is actually not in order. And so that's why it matters. I feel like in Haiti, almost everybody that we worked with were women in so many cases because, as you know, women are the most vulnerable. Women are the ones who, in post-earthquake, in post-disaster, post-conflict, women are the most vulnerable people, women and children. So those are the people that are recipients of so much of what we give. So how we look when we get there in terms of our own diversity matters to how we offer them, how we work with them with aid. So that's how I think it connects.
Yeah, and just one example, similar in nature, is that in Jordan there was an effort to get refugees work permits, and in the end, after the first year, only 4% had been given to women. And there are a lot of barriers, but I think to me that's another example of, we really need to listen, interview people. Who is interviewing really matters in those contexts because you're asking different questions and seeing different challenges based on your own experience. And then one other example is that, so I work at a think tank, so we're kind of one step removed from the direct interface with potential beneficiaries, but there was a recent study covered in The Economist that found that there are systematic differences in how female and male economists, so both economists, the solutions that they tend towards. So men tend to prefer and default to market-based solutions. Women tend to show greater concern about environmental degradation and components. So I think that's even at the analytical point of view, and when you talk about policymakers, having different perspectives really matters.
Yeah.
And I'll just say on how we break through on the leadership of these organizations and shaming, I do think the societal pressure is important. And we look at the UN Secretary General Guterres, who was appointed, there was a lot of pressure to finally appoint a woman, and there was a lot of very qualified female candidates who were considered. And when a man was selected again, there was rightly a lot of outrage around that. So he picked a woman to be his second in command, and now within a year, they have 50% parity within senior leadership in the UN just because this is my personal feelings, but he is just too embarrassed to do otherwise as being a man selected for that role again. So granted, we still don't have a female at the top, but it has created some change within a year, and that I think the next time it will be really embarrassing for the UN if there isn't a woman at the top.
But just one more thing. I think it's also, I agree, but there's shame. But I think there's also, there's a lot of sort of social movements around boycotting, in companies and things like that. But just looking statistically at black women leadership at the CEO level in the U.S. Right now, there is 0 black women in charge of a Fortune 500 company in the United States. 0, none. There's 6 men, and there's 0 women. And so the reality is that all that shaming and all that but at the end of the day, we have to really understand why Is it this, and why we can't break the barrier with women, and what does it take to bring them? So I agree with shaming, and I would agree with writing all that, but I just looking at the fact that 0 of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States headed by a black woman after the woman from Xerox left. That says something about trust, which this idea that women are not as stressed, they're more emotional and and weaker or whatever. And so I think all these things, these kinds of sort of cultural biases that we don't even, like you said in the beginning, we don't even really see it until we are in it, right? And I feel like this is where we need to be really hammering this home and forcing companies, and by petitioning them and boycotting them is a way to get past that, so that we could share why do we need this women to be in the pipeline. I don't know how many women were considered for the UN job, but at the end of the day, a guy still got, and I'm sure the woman was equally as qualified, right? So what do we need to make in that situation? How do we get to the next stage? I think that's
There's
what
mostly men with implicit bias who are making those
who
decisions.
making the decision,
so,
right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have covered a lot. We are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank our panelists, our fantastic panel. Round of applause, please. Big thank you for everyone who joined us here in the room today, for those who are joining live on the live stream that is happening right now. I think it's just important, something we've heard a number of times throughout this conversation, is that showing up is a big part of this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.